Hello, welcome back, everyone. Thank you again to December Labs and to Marcelo for those great opening remarks. Our first session today is the Holy Trinity of Dev plus Design collaboration is finally here. In this session, attendees will leave knowing how to keep a remote team of designers and developers working on different parts of an application in sync while managing changes in QA through a single backlog. You will also learn how to keep a client engaged and invested without giving into the desire to create a screen-first approach. And finally, you will learn how to adhere to an incredibly high degree of precision, both in design and development, while spread out across the world. I would like to introduce Bessie Kim and Ian McDowell of Argo Design.
Hey, welcome
Good
everybody.
morning.
Thanks, James, for the intro. Yeah, my name is Ian McDowell. I'm a technology director here at Argo Design. I'm joined today by Bessie Kim, who's in our Amsterdam office. She's a design lead there. And it's really apt that we're really spread out across all of this, right? Because that's one of the primary focuses of this talk. A little bit about Argo, just to start with. We're a product design firm actually headquartered here in Austin, Texas. Started in 2014 by Mark Ralston, who is the chief creative officer at Frog Design for the better part of a decade. Left to start his own design firm along with a few others. I joined in around June, July of that year. So I've been with him from the start, and it really was, a startup in the truest sense of the word. We had, I was employee number 13 or so. We've since grown. It's been an incredible ride to be along with for that. Speaking to that growth is the fact that we have an Amsterdam office as well as a New York City office. So just seeing that along the way has been really incredible. We've also when we started, we were working primarily with other startups as well. We've since transitioned into a really broad portfolio, primarily of Fortune 500 companies. So the growth in there has been incredible. And I've worked with a ton of different companies. I've been doing consulting for the better part of 8 years. I think I've worked 20 to 30 different companies and teams with different design people in different offices all over the world. And what's sort of come up with primarily the pandemic, but there was a couple things before it, was just this stretch out across the globe and how we really communicate and foster innovation and keep design and development in sync. Being on the technology side, but always having a foot in design. I've served a role throughout my career as really transitioning between those two and acting as a liaison. And while that serves a purpose, it's often better if you can have your designers and developers talking directly. Obviously, if you're all sitting in the same room and you're all part of a brand, for instance, and you're all working together to solve a cohesive set of problems, that's much easier. But what happens when you're spread out, right? If we take a look at sort of the global environment right now, and how we can collaborate. We see these challenges sort of transcend not just an individual firm or an individual set of offices or client-partner relationship, but really, right now, we're all remote. So these sort of challenges and working through them become paramount. But there's a strong argument to be made that even as you solve these in the current space that we're in now, a lot of these ideals and foundational elements to this collaborative workflow will easily extend post-pandemic and once we're all back in the office, so to speak. So let's look at some of the environmental challenges we currently have right now, right? Working across time and space. Now, it's one thing to be separated by distance. It's a whole nother to be separated by time. And we'll get into that a little bit in the next couple of slides. But also, how do we maintain clear communication, especially with a lot of nearshoring and offshoring? Language barriers can easily become a challenge. And how do you make sure that you're leaving a thread through that entire workflow? Managing these revisions and feedback. How do you do QA in a design dev collaborative space, especially if you don't have a dedicated QA department? A lot of smaller firms or startups will really be bootstrapped in, people serving multiple roles. So how can we effectively do that? And finally, this notion of a design language system. Now, this is something that I think a lot of startups feel is maybe too mature for them. that they need to move fast, they need to be agile. But I'd make a really strong argument that a design language system allows you to do that with greater speed and efficiency, and actually, get more things done faster with a cohesive design language that spreads across design and development. So if we look at, our issue, right? This project that we're going to be referencing for this particular sort of case study was actually DreamWorks, and we've been working with them for the better part of a year, designing some internal tool sets for their internal workflow on how they make movies. It's been a fascinating client. It's incredibly technically complex. And our setup was equally complex. So it started actually with our Amsterdam design team traveling to Los Angeles. This was back in December of last year. Spent the better part of like 2 weeks there, and had a really good time, and then flew back, and we're supposed to be flying back and forth like once a month to do these design syncs. A couple months in, like just before March, development really started ramping up. Myself, being in Austin, Texas, was flying out to LA. We had another developer in Los Angeles. And we are also bringing on resources from Kiev in the Ukraine, some more development resources. So where did that get us, right? It got us 12 people stretched across 11 time zones. Now, obviously, the pandemic hit and nobody's going anywhere. So that is our working path, right? That is what we have to work with going forward. So there's obviously challenges involved with that, but there's also opportunities. Now, the interesting part for us was that being so spread out pretty much ensures that we're working 24/7. We're constantly overlapping times. We really only get like 2 to 3 hours a day where the entirety of our teams can meet at a somewhat reasonable hour. Obviously, late in the day for Kiev and Amsterdam, early in the day for LA, and right at the beginning for our Austin members. But we had a really strong relationship between design and development, and most of those resources being in Amsterdam and Kiev, that they were able to communicate inside of their time zone, and then transition into stuff towards the end of the day that came in and got reviewed in Los Angeles and LA. Slack also was our friend, keeping channels abreast with each other, and consistent check-ins. We had a really strong cadence of sync ups and stand ups. Nobody's standing anymore. And that really allowed us to maintain the work that we were doing, as well as know what was going to be happening for that next 12 to 18 hours where, we were sort of in black, and not really able to communicate effectively. But by keeping a consistent schedule, and knowing and keeping abreast of what everybody was working on for that next overlapping segment, we'd wake up to a full inbox, but otherwise everything proceeded as normal. All right, so that was our challenge. How did we solve it? I've used a mix of tools over the years. We all started, MS Paint, right, to to Corel, to Photoshop, to Sketch, and now Figma. Figma is this really, really hot new thing. It's actually been around for quite a few years, but as a design tool, we're going to get into that a little bit and how that really, really helps in this sort of environment. The other two pieces, Jira for workflow management and product ownership, setting up stories and tickets and assignments and lanes, as well as the new player, at least in my view, on the development side, which is Storybook. Storybook actually allows you to see the components that you're making and have alignment with the Figma and with Jira. You get kind of all of the best pieces of collaboration inside of one development resource. So we really looked at this as a holistic operating system. Right. We spoke about Jira being command and control. We utilized Figma, to obviously do our design vision. But then ultimately Storybook was left as our source of truth. Now, all of this was based initially upon Ant Design. Now, Ant Design as a library. It has Figma components. It has React components. It's actually been developed by Alibaba. So some of the documentation is Chinese. Some people find that a little bit difficult, but there's tons of forums and helpful things to get through and manage all that. But it's an incredibly robust system. It contains a full design language system. And when we talk about a DLS, one of the primary things that we want to focus on with that is an atomic design approach. We've been advocates at Argo for a very long time about this, really see it as the way to build things. Because I think, far too often people get into the trap of designing for screens, and they'll want to see a finished product in design and then, a finished feature in development the next sprint, right? We did not do that. We took Ant Design, took it at face value, took it for the component libraries that it presented to us, and then skinned it. Started adding new features and replacing some pieces that didn't quite work while keeping integrity intact. But then brought that entire DLS from Ant that comes sort of out of the box, brought it into Figma, and then applied our own theming and our own styling to it on top of that existing framework. Where things didn't need to be touched, we didn't touch them. But where we knew there was a component that we wanted to increase fidelity of or give a new spin to, and it made sense to do that, we would. All of this then transitions into Storybook, which I've mentioned is a React-based library of components, and we'll show off some of that later. And all of that ends up going into the application. Now, the interesting part with this is that while the mock-ups and then the interaction designs were all done in Figma, all of the QA was actually done in Storybook. So we utilize Docker as a development container that sort of just all-in-one encompasses everything on the Storybook and the application side. And actually, it allowed and facilitated our designers to pull down a branch, read-only, from GitHub and place it inside of the system, spin it up, an actual instance of that environment on their machine, and actually QA the actual development code and see how it looked inside of Storybook before approving and having a merge go through. The app itself was actually the least touched piece of everything from a QA and a development and a design perspective. We knew our screens, we knew our broader componentry and how those built out and encapsulated themselves. But the app itself was one of the least touched things because we were so confident in the componentry being correct and QA'd, that once placed inside the system, it's always an instance of that component. So we had full integrity across the system. We weren't building one-off components for a singular page. Everything was really in place there. So how did we manage that? Right. Well, everybody uses Jira. At least a lot of people do. It's an Atlassian product. You do have to pay for it, but I'd argue there's definitely not a better workload management and product management tool out there. The one thing that we did that was incredibly unique to this project, and we will absolutely continue going forward, is that we utilized the same board and the same project for both design and development. And this was incredible. Every other project I've been on, for the most part, design and development are two separate entities with two separate Jira boards. And what ends up happening? Well, names get slightly different. Nomenclature is slightly off between them. Maybe they're following a different sprint schedule. There's a ticket for a design QA pass, and then they have to create another one for a development QA pass to fix the thing they noticed in the design. We didn't do any of that. We utilized everything within the same board. So design would find a QA issue, assign it to development, and it stayed, column for column along in the singular Jira board. So we knew end to end when a design task started and when it was finished in development, we were ensuring that whole thing. We kept a similar sprint schedule. We were all in the same sprint. We presented to the client both design and development at the same time. We kept 3-week sprints, which actually, at first blush seems like that's too long, right? Everybody typically transcends to 2 weeks. But we found that if you stick with a 3-week, the ceremonies that are important to an agile process don't take up nearly as much of the totality of that sprint as they do in a 2-week sprint. Oftentimes you're finding yourself, going from meeting to meeting to meeting, and we really spread ourselves out as far as what we were able to deliver and get through an entire QA pass, so that when we started work on a particular feature from the development side, we could pretty much ensure that by the end of the 3rd week, it would be integrated into the development branch. And that was almost universally true throughout our entire thing. We also kept our meetings, rather minimal, only really meeting when we needed to, and otherwise keeping all of our leads abreast a few times a week, and actually reduced the amount of client touch points that we had, recognizing that their time is valuable too. And if anyone's seen any of my other talks, return on time and that UX philosophy is paramount, I think, to success, not only from a user interface perspective, but also a client management perspective. So that gets us into Figma. And Bessie, would you like to take over?
Awesome, thanks, Ian. Before we jump into the design system in Figma, I actually want to touch on a couple of challenges that teams may face when creating a design system. And as Ian mentioned before, it requires time. And so it may be challenging for teams to justify that investment upfront, but it's very important to remember that for the efficiency of the team in the long run, it makes it so much faster and easier because you have these set of reusable components that you can use. And the second one is that developers and designers think of reusable components differently. As a designer, we think about a design system in a tool like Figma and how it's documented, whereas developers think about how it is implemented in the application. And that's exactly what we aim to tackle here is, how do we create that single source of truth by utilizing Figma, Storybook, and Jira? Which goes to the reason why we chose Figma as our design tool is that for that real-time collaboration. The fact that it's a web application makes it easy for everyone to be able to share links with one another. We can share links with our clients, and they're able to review our work just seamlessly from their browser. And if you're also thinking about moving maybe over from Sketch into Figma, it's also nice to know that there is a free account and you can create up to, I think, 3 projects, so you can test it out. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how we actually set up our file structure inside of Figma. It's important for us to have this shared library that can be accessed by the entire team. So what we did was created a dedicated space for our design system. So this really makes it easy for teams to be able to quickly find where the libraries are. And it also allows us to decouple it from any specific application. So you can see that we have a dark and a light theme, and those 2 themes can be applied to a number of different applications. And that's actually what we're currently doing now is we're using those same styles and components to build new apps. So styles is really the foundation of a design system. It expresses the feeling of a brand and includes things like colors, typography, and spacing. And so as you saw before, we had a dark and a light theme, and we needed to come up with a system to codify the styles so that we could easily apply these 2 themes to any number of components, to all of the components. And we did that by creating a common taxonomy. For colors, as an example, we broke it out into 3 buckets: text, classification, and UI. And this really helps the team to be very targeted at describing how we use colors for components. We take the same logic also in the naming of our tokens. And just to describe what tokens are, it's really a kind of a naming convention to describe visual attributes. So instead of using hex values for colors or pixels for spacing, we describe how it is applied into the UI. So what I mean by that is instead of saying, this color is blue 4, we describe how it is applied. So we call that text interactive 01. And this helps the team to kind of cross-check each other's work and make sure that we're using the colors in the way that it's intended. With the design system, we always look kind of how does this scale in the long run. And so we came up with this 12 scale color system, and it's great because we have a set of default colors we can fall back on as we create new components like data visualization. And it also helps us to have this balanced consistency across our themes. So as you can see, we use shades of 4s for all of our dark theme componentry. And we use 7s for the light theme and 10s for the high contrast. A nice little tip here is change your color setting to HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminosity, to make sure that you have that consistency and brightness. As Ian mentioned before, we leverage Ant Library. So we try and keep the structure as closely as possible to Ant. And it's really a skinning exercise where all of the states and behaviors are already defined, so the team can work very quickly and we can apply those styles that we've defined to those existing components. We can, of course, add to this library, and we have been creating custom components to kind of meet specific needs for this program. And, true to the nature of atomic design, we start with the smallest elements and we use those atoms to build out bigger elements. So here you can see we start with cells, and those cells form rows and table groups. And again, we can use plugins like Figma inside of this tool to just take a component and simply switch the style, and it would cascade, those styles would cascade through the components very easily. As part of also that handoff with development, we do some documentation on the side for things like spacing and basic behaviors. And as Ian mentioned earlier, with Jira, it's very important, for us to always have that seamless collaboration with development. So we create these status pills to communicate the state of the design. So here we are saying there's a design change and it needs to be updated in development. And right next to that, we have a link that goes out to the Jira ticket. As we go through the review cycle, the board will eventually be marked as done. So templates acts as a reference point so that the team can kind of come in here and take a look at what the product should look like in its kind of final state. And having these reusable components, I can really speak to the fact that it really speeds up the process for design. And we've been actually clicking together these new applications using our components that we created. And it has been just an amazing experience so far. And with that, I'll hand it back to Ian to talk about Storybook.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so Figma being that collaborative web-based environment, we obviously are able to all look at the same board at the same time in terms of the Figma board. That is an incredible advancement that really has helped open up, the collaboration across space and time as we've gone through everything, and especially sharing it with clients. But if we look at Storybook, now Storybook, like I mentioned before, is a React-based component viewer, right? So what does that mean? We'll get into a little bit here. The challenges of using this DLS and always with design and development is ensuring parity between these two. We spoke about a token system. What we're looking at right now is actually running Storybook. And the screen on your right is literally the Figma boards that we were just looking at. So you actually embed a live Figma board in here and have true one-to-one comparison between your development resources, which we're looking at here, and your design tokens. So those come back and forth. And really, starting in a design language system like this and Atomic, you do start with your smallest things first, right? So you ensure consistency in your colors, your spacing, your typography. One of the other beautiful parts about Storybook is that we actually get all of the code right in here. It's actually pulling from the core React components themselves. We're also able to switch themes and can copy the code directly from here. So there's a one-to-one correlation between what actually goes into a production build from an application standpoint and what is developed and shown here inside of Storybook. We've actually even taken this a step further. In our newest version, the first version of this we built, sort of within the application. We've actually gone through the process now of extracting it out and pulling, all of these common components that we're going to reuse across now multiple applications inside of its own repository that can then be used to start and templatize other applications, so that they're all pulling from this same centralized repository of components and styles that have all been QA'd, that have all been gone through from a design and development perspective. And we can ensure that no matter which developer is using these parts, they're all using the exact same ones. That is a huge deal, because if you've ever been on a project with multiple devs and everybody kind of does a button slightly differently, or a radio or a drop-down menu slightly differently based upon the screen they were assigned, you know all too well the QA problems and the management headache that involves. Utilizing this sort of a process alleviates us from all of that. Also, all the documentation we're getting inside these things. Some of them have auto docs based upon how you set them up. You're actually able to generate documentation directly inside of this. So Storybook really ends up being our single sole source of truth, from design through development to the client. And obviously that all transpiles up into these templates. React on its own is a really compositional framework, right? So it's a natural inheritance to use this sort of design language to build up these bigger and bigger pieces, even into things like list views. We built out a virtual table. This is actually one instance where we actually dropped the ant table in order to get better performance out of our own that we rolled. But it's still completely compatible with that base framework. And that was really important to maintain as we move forward, because we didn't want to redo every single piece. We gained a lot of efficiencies in the code by doing it this way. And that really sort of speaks to the overall thing. Like, we had essentially 3 developers, really 2 for a while, that built up an application, starting with all this componentry. And we're going to go through a little bit of it now, just a really broad brush of what this application looks like and how it performs. But this entire thing was built in essentially 6 months, start to finish, from utilizing this existing component library up through this fully running application with a incredibly robust back end. Highly modular components, all dynamically driven from JSON data. We've got theme switching inside of it, which is actually a really cool thing. If we wanted to add in a 3rd or 4th or however many themes we want, it's incredibly easy to do, and it completely solves all of those sort of QA issues from trying to maintain multiple sets of CSS. We're actually utilizing styled components as opposed to any sort of Sass or less transpiled style sheets, which really kind of speaks to how easily this is to move through. So what's next? So we've actually just about launched our 1.0 of this application, and as I said, we're moving into multiple apps now. And now we can really see efficiencies that have really pushed us forward, because we're actually able to design and develop using that same set of shared components. And push this out into multiple apps, knowing that everything's already been QA'd. The efficiencies gained there are fantastic. Cool. Looks like we got a couple questions, so we'll get into that. Bessie, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, nothing to add.
Cool.
Thank you.
I'll stop sharing. So we got a couple different questions. We got Bill has asked, what do you mean by design language? I don't know if maybe we answered that, but essentially a design language, like we've said, really starts from those core pieces, spacing, typography, color, those foundational elements that you use to build everything else out. And then it's about consistency, right? And reusing those pieces and reusing those themes throughout the entirety of your application. If there's any commercial packages, I don't know the commercial packages. There's a ton of open source though, and that's one of the beautiful things. So Ant, totally open source. Anybody can go download it, start using it, start extending it. IBM has their own. Microsoft has another one. A lot of the larger companies are really embracing this, and most of them, especially if you're designing for something that wants to go inside of an ecosystem, will have open source resources available to you that you can easily pull in and utilize free of charge.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, it really is almost like a visual representation of spoken language. So, you start with the basic foundations, which are the colors and typography, and that is this shared visual language that we speak within our team. And then you actually start to have these conversations, which is the expression of that language in an application. And so that conversation, you can have many, many conversations in totally different contexts by just changing up a color theme, for example. Yeah.
Cool. Bill also asked, how do we handle accessibility requirements? That's actually a really apt question. Just internally, we've just been getting started with a lot of those. Certain frameworks handle it better than others. Certain frameworks definitely have better documentation. Notably the Microsoft stuff kind of all comes out of the box. Anytime you get to more of an enterprise level, they'll definitely handle it a little bit better. That being said, Ant supports everything from an accessibility standpoint. You just have to wire it up. So again, going back to this atomic system, what that enables us to do is modify our button component, add an ARIA label, for example, and that will automatically extend into every single instance of that component throughout the application. So that's one of the beautiful parts of using an atomic system like this, is when you do need to make a change, a small change one place can propagate throughout the entire system. Now, that obviously means you have to be very careful and cognizant of the changes that you're making, having good documentation and knowing those implications. You can't just go in and start, freewheeling through everything and modifying stuff, because you need to understand, how that spreads throughout the application and have respect for that language. The moment you start, breaking away for, well, just this one piece, is the moment your system fails. And now you've gotten to a maintenance nightmare. And I think one of the key things that I'm most proud about for this team, and that what we've been able to do in 6 months is not only, start to finish, build up from scratch and launch this internal project. We have no technical debt, which is incredible. Like, there's just none. There's nothing to go back and fix that we were going to get to eventually, because we've done it right the first way and from the onset. And I think that really speaks to using a language like this and having alignment between design and development ensures that you don't have any of that, because you haven't just waited and pushed stuff off. It's a really, really good feeling about that. Let's see. What was the biggest challenge we faced when building our integrated process? I'll still go back to the time piece, probably, right? Like we really do only get like 2-3 hours a day, where it's reasonable for everybody to meet. I think we'd all love more. I think we still struggle with whiteboarding some. Figma is really good in that it's online and collaborative, and you can see each other interact on the same page at the same time. But a really, really strong whiteboarding tool, I think, is still something that it's just hard to replace, being in the same room and drawing ideas out in front of everybody and really collaborating like that. That I don't know, that seems to still be the biggest one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, because we have quite a tight running ship now, which is more of a task-based, and, working remotely across time zones works really well when you have very clear tasks, coming back to Jira of something is in progress, it gets moved to in review, and then you get that gets marked as done. But definitely, I think in that early exploration phase, from a design point of view, when we're brainstorming on interaction patterns, what is the ideal different states and how it behaves, I think that still is a little tricky remotely.
Yeah. Let's see. We got another question. Mars view. I'm not sure what that is. Okay. And let's see. Do you think you can move to continuous improvement with your current tools and skills? Do you want to go to continuous improvement? And that's sort of a broad question. The one area that we're getting into right now, especially as we're decoupling our main sort of Storybook and DSL from our initial application and moving into other ones, is some automated testing, right? And from a CI/CD sort of pipeline, that really starts to become critical, so that we can ensure that, on the one hand, inside of Storybook, our core components are matching, and especially from that compositional nature, like I said, a small change one place actually propagates through everything. And an automated testing suite, we're actually going to be using Jest and Puppeteer, which actually is a headless browser that takes screenshots of every single component in each state. And then reports back like, oh, hey, there's some pixel differences between this version and the last. So it helps you catch those change propagations as you move throughout the system from a development perspective. So ensuring that every change that gets made when you make one was intended. So that sort of piece works really well for us right now. And then we're going to be doing some end-to-end testing on the actual application itself.
Yeah, I'd like to add actually to this one. I think there is a lot of customization that can be done with Storybook in the way that we organize components and the ability to actually turn on and off certain attributes. So what I mean by that is you could have a single button in Storybook, and simply by turning on and off different variables, like have this as a disabled state or change this to a secondary button, that can be all controlled by these actions. And I think the real benefit of that is, again, the organization and how you can simplify how the components are structured inside of Storybook. So I think that's something that we would love to dig a little bit deeper on and improve on.
Yeah. Not seeing any other questions. So if there's none, we'll give you back a little bit of your day, unless you had anything else to add.
No, thank you everyone for spending your morning with us. This has been fun.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. And hopefully we'll see you all in person next year.
That was Bessie Kim, design lead at Argo Design, and Ian McDowell, technology director at Argo Design. Thank you both so much for that fascinating session. Your suggestions for streamlining the design and development process is immensely valuable in what feels like increasingly separated remote working conditions. I especially enjoyed your breakdown of Storybook. What a powerful tool that I have never used before. I'm certain that your hard work developing this holy trinity of dev and design collaboration will be of massive use for myself and many others that attended this session.